Views expressed in the following program are those of the individual authors and participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University, the United States Air Force, the Air Command and Staff College, or the Department of Defense.
Welcome again to another show. I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Dean here and Dr. Kruzer from the Air Command and Staff College, Dr. Davis from the Political Science Department, and today we want to talk about Iran and what we need to know about the current situation in Iran. So I want to ask my first question to Dr. Dean. Iran's in the news a lot now. We're worried about Iran, but it's got a past history in the Middle East that I'd like people to be familiar with. Would you mind letting us know?
Sure, I can give you a thumbnail summary of it. It's a very old country, known as Persia into the 1920s. Had a great empire, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, and to this day, Iranians look upon that great Persian past. Now, in what would be our Middle Ages, they declined as a power. They became a backwater, first converting to Sunni Islam, and then about 6 centuries later, converting to Shia. Shia Islam comes late to Persia. The Kruzer dynasty ran the country. It's overthrown in 1921. And one of the things that brought it down is in 1907, Britain and Russia, as part of great power rivalry, split the country in 3 parts. The Russians got the north, you had a neutral zone, and then the British got the south, where British petroleum began exploring. And from 1907 to the 1950s, Iran was very important for British oil supply. And you have in 1921 these Cossacks led by Reza Pahlavi overthrow the Kruzer dynasty. You don't have a legitimate monarchy anymore. And they're going to rule first through him and then his son till 1979. During World War II, Reza Shah supported the Nazis, created a crisis for the British because you had a pro-Nazi coup in Iran and you had German and Vichy pilots in Syria. So the whole British Middle East enterprise was threatened, and they responded by removing them. You have, after World War II, his son, what we talk about is the Shah, trying to modernize the country. Not successful at first. The British have control of the oil. A nationalist by the name of Mossadegh tries to take control of the oil and throw the British out. The new Eisenhower administration comes in and British MI6 say they're commies. And with that, the CIA becomes involved, throws out Mossadegh, and assures the control of the Shah to the 1970s.
Dr. Kruzer, we have a very interesting state in modern Iran. It is a democracy, and it describes itself as a democracy republic, but obviously it's a theocratic state where the Shia clerics have very high power within the regime. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about that? What exactly is the current structure of Iran, and why should we really hesitate to call it a democracy?
Yeah. Well, there's several interesting questions there because, yes, it classifies itself as a republic. It is the Islamic Republic, and in part it's due to this history that Bill just spoke about, that in the run-up to the Shah being overthrown, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini spent a lot of his time in France. And so during that time in exile, he was an observer of French politics. And he was also, many people now forget, especially with the long history of hostility between the United States and the Islamic Republic, that there was actually a time in the 1970s when the United States was actually considering, once they saw that the Shah's days were numbered, they actually considered backing the Ayatollah's regime because, again, it's the Cold War, and so the last thing they wanted if the Shah fell was it to fall to communism. So he seemed like a less bad option at the time. So the government that the Revolutionary Republic was looking at putting in place is actually heavily modeled after the government of the Fifth Republic of France. So that's where they get their president, the parliament, and the basic organization of this republican structure. Now, it was originally, though, sold that Ayatollah Khomeini was going to, like so many other revolutionary leaders, think back to Lenin, think back to the radicals in the French Revolution, they were going to spearhead this revolution, they were going to oversee the process and gradually hand it back to the people. But they have devised since a number of systems to keep this Islamic flavor on top of what nominally looks like this republican system. So most famously, we have the supreme leader above the president, who is the successor to Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, that's Ayatollah Khomeini today. He in turn is appointed by the Council of Experts, who is a group of elected religious leaders who have to in turn be also selected by another powerful group, which is the Guardian Council. The Guardian Council in turn is the one that is responsible also for vetting all candidates for any office in Iran. So when we talk about an election that's upcoming, be it for a president, for parliament, or anything like that, every single one of these people has to be vetted by the religious leaders as being worthy of the office and carrying on the Islamic Republic. Yeah.
So, Dr. Kruzer, you mentioned in your comments just now that the U.S. was thinking about getting closer to the Ayatollah. And there have been several times in the history where we've had better relationships with Iran and worse relationships with Iran. Dr. Dean, could you kind of walk us through some of those instances?
Sure. In the Iran-Iraq War in 1980, 88, 89, Ayatollah centralized his power. He created the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Quds Force, Basaji Force. And then when he dies in 89, under people like Khatami and later Rafsanjani, they moved to a more moderate government, and you had these political tensions inside Iran between the pragmatists and the jihadis, and so they get played off and on. When 9/11 happens, you actually have a more moderate government in Iran, and it looks like we're making progress towards a relationship. The Iranians even help us when we go into Afghanistan in 2001. But the problem is President W. Bush's talk on the axis of evil and laying out Iran as an axis of evil really put our relationship backward and led to Khomeini putting in Ahmadinejad. Khomeini plays back and forth between pragmatists and moderates and the fire eaters, the jihadis.
And the interesting thing to point to, like you mentioned briefly, the time post-2001 in Afghanistan. The Afghanistan conflict versus the Iraq conflict illustrates, even on our side, the problems that we have to deal with. And this, from an international relations standpoint, comes to this argument of realism versus liberalism, with a lot of realists pointing to, prior to 9/11, a lot of people forget that in 1998, 1999, Iran almost went to war with the Taliban over their treatment of Shiites in the region. There's a lot of places in Afghanistan where our interests between the United States and the Iranians were heavily aligned, whereas in Iraq they were going in very different directions. So there's this question of, do we need a consistent foreign policy based on values and broader interests, or can we divide up these conflicts and say that where our interests align we can work together, and where they diverge, that's when we're going to have to hold a stronger line.
Excellent. Thank you guys for that. I have a follow-up question also for both of you. And if we look at Iran, obviously it is a big threat to U.S. national security. This goes back to the Reagan administration with the bombings in Beirut, its sponsorship of Hezbollah. Can you guys talk about Iran and the threats that it constitutes and poses to the United States?
In 1983-84, the Iranians created Hezbollah. They became heavily involved in Lebanon. I think they emerged as the most serious a terrorist group to the United States. You know, Al-Qaeda waxes and wanes. ISIS, for the moment, has kind of burned itself out. But Hezbollah is constant, and they're all over the world. You find them in South America. You find them off of the coast of Venezuela. They're a big, pervasive, well-trained threat, and they're capable of fighting. They caused us no end of worry inside Iraq. And it's really in the Iraq War, more than anything else, that the temperature between the United States and Iran boiled over, between them launching attacks inside the country, Soleimani directing Quds Force activities inside the country. That really created more and more tension between them. And then the Syria situation has not led to things getting better.
Yeah, in the Iraq War in particular, especially the first phases from 2003 to 2010, Operation Iraqi Freedom, this was a major flashpoint, because really going back to the 1990s, the post-Cold War order, when the United States is still trying to figure out its new role both in the world more broadly, but also the Middle East in particular. Again, we had backed the Shah's regime for so long, that was our source of strength in the region. We've gone back and forth with the Saudis and others, but for the most part, we were torn on the issue of the Iran-Iraq question. So our policy through most of that time was what's come to be known as dual containment, trying to keep either of them from emerging as a hegemon in the region. And then once in 2003, we decided to go in and knock down one of those two we're containing. The Iranians have a great opportunity. Now, we had a lot of divisions, and we still do. And you see this play out readily because, of course, most people who look at Iraq know that it's got a Shia majority population, about 60%, which on the religious side aligns it more with the Iranians. On the other hand, ethnically, these are Arabs as opposed to traditional Persians that is dominant in Iran. So there's a couple of different potential flashpoints. And we had originally, I think, hoped that the Arab narrative would trump the religious narrative, but the Iranians have been much more savvy in terms of how they have integrated into the Shiite Arab culture and how they have reached out to it in ways that has been a bit baffling for our initial reaction in the 2003-2010 timeframe.
The big dream of the W. Bush administration was to first deal with Afghanistan. They did that quickly. That gave them a sense of hubris. They went in to Iraq. They thought they could knock Iraq out, and then their ultimate goal was to invade Iran. Now, once Iraq went south and exploded into an insurgency, that no longer was practical. And as Dr. Kruzer said, they're trying to engage in containment. But what's happened is our fighting in Iraq, the heavy casualties, the perception of American loss, the withdrawal of American troops, and then having to come back, has created a strong sense of almost Iranian dominance in Iraq. And one of the things that saved us is the Iranians have been so obnoxious, they've alienated a lot of the Iraqis. But we're very worried about the Iranians being dominant there. The Iranians in some ways are seeking to grab hegemony in the region.
One thing that I'd like to follow up on with both of you is the difference. We talked about George W. Bush's presidency, and then Obama takes over, and Obama softens his position towards Iran. They get closer, and they sign a deal, and then Trump comes in and totally changes that. So how would you describe the last few American presidents' relationship with Iran and what that has led to in the region?
Yeah, it's interesting because normally we like to talk about how even though on the surface there seems to be a lot of at least short-term tactical differences between American foreign policy, in general it's pretty consistent. But this is one issue where there's been a lot of variation over the past couple of years. Obama is elected in late 2008, comes into office 2009, not exactly as a peace candidate, but he is bringing that with him. He famously rises to his first influence on the international stage in 2002, opposing the Iraq War, saying, "I'm not against war, I'm just against dumb wars," and citing Iraq as an example of what he saw as the dumb war. So when he first comes into office, he's very much taking what we would talk of as a defensive realist position. Not such an extreme as Trump did, but to that point of we need to rebalance toward domestic issues. We're too spread out across too many issues among the world, and we need to start passing off these responsibilities to allies and to the local powers to deal with. And so part of that was looking at re-engaging with Iran in a different way. Instead of, as the Bush administration was doing, with the very hard line, how can we come up with a way to, if not eliminate the Iranian nuclear program, at least continue to push it off a little while? Because if you can keep perpetually pushing something off like that, realistically in policy world, that's often as best you can hope for, because anything can change. Even if you have a sound deal to kill a program now, it can reemerge at some point. Now, once the second Obama administration rolls around, he had basically gotten a bit too defensive in his realist positions, and there were a number of fires began to pop up again, most famously being ISIS. But again, you have issues in Afghanistan, issues elsewhere in the world, the Arab Spring. All these things cause problems that makes the Obama administration realize they've pivoted too far away. And so the second administration becomes much more hegemonic in terms of how it approaches things. And this then becomes the angle that Donald Trump is going to exploit, where he's going to take a very strong arm against Iran, cite Iran as the main source of the problem. So get out of that nuclear deal, which is seen as bad, take a much harder line against Iran, meanwhile try to extricate a troop presence in a number of other issues.
It wasn't really that hard for Trump to get out of the nuclear deal, because after they signed it, the Iranians continuously embarrassed the Obama administration. And so a lot of people started feeling they had signed a bad deal, and more importantly, an unenforceable deal that they really could not stop through paper the development of Iranian nuclear weapons. And of course, one of the big things that changes Obama's thinking is the invasion of the Crimea and the Donbass. That shifted some of his thinking's problems in 2011 and onwards to the emergence of a civil war in Syria. Iran goes in and saves the Assad family. If there is no Iranian help, and that starts with Ahmadinejad, he's a big fan of that, they become heavily involved, and then very quickly we see their capacity is limited. Whereas Obama seeks to kind of contain the Iranians, Trump is much more worried about the growing Iranian hegemony in the region, and so he kind of half-heartedly tries to put together some kind of alliance to contain them, to link up the Gulf states. I think as we see, it's not very that tight an alliance, but there was certainly an attempt to counter perceived Iranian growing hegemony. One thing let me say about nuclear power. The Shah of Iran, hardly a jihadi, wanted nuclear power. He wanted Iran to be the third greatest power in the world, and these hearkening back to Darius and Xerxes and all that, to interpret this in terms of Islamic fascism or fanaticism is a mistake.
No, absolutely. It goes back to the Persian culture and this idea of the national pride that is something that long predates the regime, and there's lots of question marks along that. But one other point to raise, though, about what you just said in terms of the way these alliances were set up and what ended up happening with the role that the Iranians played in Syria. This is also going to play a big role inside of Iraq in the same time frame, and this is what's going to lead ultimately to the 2019-2020 Iran crisis down the road, because as we're looking at building these international coalitions and basically playing into the hands of, again, Shiite unity versus Arab unity in a way, because as they're trying to align different states against the Iranians are building up the PMF, which is their Popular Mobilization Fronts inside of Iraq, and those are the famous Shiite militias that are basically modeled off of Lebanese Hezbollah. Two of them actually hold the name Hezbollah themselves, and these guys are going to be seen in a lot of Iraq as actually the winners of the war against ISIS, as opposed to the American forces through CJTF-OIR.
Can you show them the memento you have of the 2020 activities?
Oh, absolutely. So I was in Iraq from September 2019 through May of 2020, so I saw most of this firsthand. And it was interesting because it was originally just going to be a mopping up, just like Afghanistan. It's a mopping up operation where you guys start pulling back and downsizing. And then the first thing that happened when we got there was the Turks moved into Syria, and so we had a major change in the nature of the Syria conflict. But then we, of course, had, beginning in late December, a major amping up of tensions with the Iranians over first the PMF groups outside of Kirkuk striking one of our bases and killing an American contractor. So this in turn leads to a rapid escalation of the situation, which is an interesting study because I think it was one of those things that was unintended, but rapidly within a week approached a war situation. We thankfully stepped up from the brink, but the final step of that was when they lobbed missiles at the American bases, in particular Al-Assad. So this is a piece of shrapnel that landed on Al-Assad Air Base. We don't get to take many souvenirs back from that location, but this was one I was able to take. So, and if you can obviously see it, but you can feel it. It's quite heavy. So, but imagine thousands of these raining down on some of our U.S. bases at the time. So.
And that's the big worry about the region, is it exploding into a bigger conflict. So far we've able to create these zones of operations and influence in Syria. There is worry about obviously the Russians being involved, the Iranians being involved. The Syrian conflict has brought Russia and Iran closer, and Iran closer to China. China and North Korea play a key role in development of nuclear weapons inside Iran.
Yeah, and this is an area that it's important to talk about because we like to think about the small wars and the big nuclear activities as being very distinct from one another, but they're all very much interconnected when it comes to what Iran is doing. Because when most Americans talk about the prospect of Iran getting a bomb, the immediate concern is they would nuke Israel, and that's what a lot of the domestic discussion is. But I would tell you, I don't think that's as serious a risk as many people think. The Iranians are conservative, they're religious, but they're not as much of fanatics as many of the jihadist organizations that Americans want to lump them in with. And probably what they want a nuclear weapon for, besides the culture of national pride we've already talked about, is just like North Korea, state survival, because it is very rare for nuclear powers to directly attack one another. And so if Iran has a nuclear weapon, they're going to feel a lot more safe to engage in activities through Hezbollah, through Hamas, and through a number of their other proxy organizations, and they're going to have a freer hand to continue to work with the Chinese, the Russians, and distribute various weapon systems around the world.
There has been big social change inside Iran, particularly starting around 2009. You know, the generation that fought against Iraq and was in the initial revolution, they're very old or they're gone. And now you have this new generation that's kind of into sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's a very secular generation. There's a lot of pushback against women wearing the hijab. There's big social change going on. Khomeini can't control it. Mm-hmm. He's appointed 4 presidents. He wants to put his son in the next job, but he also faces threats inside his own country. And I would say from the Basiji force inside the IRGC, and the Quds force, and he tries to use them to control the country and even produce weapons. Part of the IRGC produces weapons for Iran, but he's got all these competing things going on, and he even has insurgency going on inside Iran. Iran is only 51% Persian. It is a multi-ethnic state. People don't realize that. It is not a monolith. Inside Baluchistan to the east, there is a major insurgency going on. The Iranians are fighting a counterinsurgency there. They're fighting in Syria. They're fighting in Iraq. They're supporting a proxy war in Saudi Arabia with the Houthis. Iran is facing strategic overstretch and social unrest at home.
Yeah. And I mentioned earlier the division. I'm sorry because you haven't been able to get a question in edgewise, but we're getting some good conversation out of this. To continue that thread, though, when you talk about, the Ayatollah is old. During COVID, there were rumors at times that he was very sick. We didn't know what would happen. And there's lots of speculation on what's going to happen with him. Yes, he would probably like to see his son replace him. The grandson of Ruhollah Khomeini is out there as well, so there's a few options there. But also when I mentioned and I laid out how this government was supposed to be set up, the Assembly of Experts is the group that's supposed to select the supreme leader, but they're also supposed to be the primary check on him. And Khomeini has done a fairly good job of really cracking down on their power. So there's a big question of whether there's going to be some pushback once Khomeini dies from the Council of Experts to reassert their own authority and put in someone weaker, or even possibly a small council or tribunal that would take that role instead. So lots of questions about the future of the regime there.
Yeah, my follow-up question would be, actually, it's a great continuation from your discussion, but it looks at Iran's presence in the Ukraine war as a weapons supplier, in particular with drones, and their involvement as unfortunately, a protagonist that's against American interests abroad, in particular in Ukraine.
I would say that it has to do with continuing their friendship with the Putin regime, but they don't have a lot to share. Again, they're facing strategic overstretch. There's only so much they can do. They've got to shore up their own population. They're worried about their own population, so it's not like they can send tons of equipment to help the Russians because they're financially stretched. They've been an international pariah. It's led to severe economic problems inside the country, and they face many security challenges themselves. I don't think Americans fully understand all the challenges that the Iranians face.
Yeah, and in the case of what the Iranians are doing, necessity has been the mother of invention, as it normally is. And so they are, because they're outstretched, their activities in Yemen, in the Israel-Palestine conflict, elsewhere across North Africa, they have a lot of opportunities, and they've had a lot of experience in trying to engineer basic modern weapon systems, but not like long-range missiles like the United States is used to building, but things that work in these small wars environments. So they've been able to jerry-rig basically IEDs in the skies and some of these long-range munitions that are very impressive when they're the first thing that's out there and it's the first time we've experienced them. But as we dig into this more, the Iranians have been quick to boast that these are indigenously produced weapons, but they're basically outer shells that are filled with American computer chips, Chinese cameras, and basically a bunch of commercial off-the-shelf technology that they've been able to pull in from a variety of basic sources. And none of it's really that advanced. That on one hand is scary because again, it shows what the potential vulnerabilities are, but it also makes it easier to defeat in the long term once the threat is recognized and we can adapt to it, which is I think part of why we're seeing so much more success being advertised in Ukraine with more of these being shot down and probably less over time coming into the country.
I would like to begin to wind down our conversation with throwing out a broader question. What should we take away from some of the discussion today that's important for us to realize here in Alabama about the importance of Iran and what it's going through that may affect us directly?
I think the threat of Iran and its bid for hegemony, which I don't think is going to work, but their bid for hegemony is going to keep American troops in the Middle East. I would say they're our number one concern at this point in the Middle East, both for naval, ground, and air force of the United States and its allies. We're going to have to keep bases and personnel. We want to pivot to the Pacific. We want to deter China in conventional means and other means, but we cannot completely forget the Middle Eastern theater, mostly because of Iran. If Iran settled down and became our ally and decided they no longer want to be a pariah of the world, that would make our strategic situation much better because, like the Iranians, we ourselves face a great deal of strategic overstretch. Where do we focus? Help Ukraine deter the Russians? How do we deal with China? Do we put everything in the China basket? Do we forget about the Middle East? And we don't talk much about Africa either in kind of a pathetic way, and the Iranians are involved there too.
Yeah, I mean, the Middle East has been critical to U.S. foreign policy and then British foreign policy before that, going back centuries, and that's unlikely to change at any time in the near future, even if reliance on oil, and frankly, the United States doesn't get a lot of its oil from the Middle East. It gets it from a lot of other allies, but it's all a global market, and so as long as our allies, particularly Japan and others, are reliant on Middle Eastern oil, that's always going to be an issue for the United States. And a lot of our issues today have the Iranian fingerprints on it. It might not be, we talk about nuclear weapons, we talk about long-range munitions, and we talk about the threat of a large-scale war emanating from that region. But we in the West like to think of war in binary terms, that we're at war or at peace. But the Iranian system right now is not geared toward that. They are invested heavily in proxy forces, in unconventional threats. Some of these they have pretty good control over. Some of them they don't have a lot of control over. When we used a raid to attack Soleimani, the big question was, is this going to be a repeat of the drug war, where by taking out one drug kingpin we make the problem worse, or not? We still don't have an answer for that, and we're going to have to keep watching it closely.
I think the key thing is we need to stop overemphasizing the threat of Iran, contain them, but don't see them as a hellacious boogeyman.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for a fascinating discussion.